force driving growth. The enormous growth in international trade and the government of capital on the stock markets made it look as though the economy was doing all right. It looked as though profit and the production of value were independent of each other, as though the process of accumulation had freed itself from the process of production. Only, of course, it hadn't. Just as manual labor hadn't disappeared, as some sociologists believed it had for a while. No, history hadn't come to an end, and the neoliberal economy didn't create growth, but an enormous amount of paper money that gave the illusion of growth in the US. Paper money endowed the period in the late 1960s with the gloss of normality. Though all the while there were crises on end. There was crisis at the beginning of the 70s, at the beginning of the 90s, the beginning of the 80s, beginning of the 90s, the beginning of the zeros, and of course again from 2007 and onwards. So if you look at the neoliberal era from the perspective of crisis and the perspective of social reproduction, this period almost takes on the character of a 30-year war in which neoliberalism attacks the working class relentlessly. But it was a Pyrrhic victory. Rejection of the working class wasn't enough to lift the rate of profit, even though it looked for a good while as if credit and revenues from shares were the solution. That stopped in, but the thing was, of course, that the financial crisis, in a certain sense, revealed this underlying, much longer, already existing crisis. Suddenly it became clear that the thoroughgoing and irreversible deindustrialization had taken place in the heartlands of capitalism. As part of the incorporation of more and more workers on a global scale, had made it possible to reduce costs and break the Moorish workers in the West, who since the 1960s had misunderstood the post-war wage productivity deal and demanded more than mere access to consumer goods and the welfare state. For part of the Western working class, neoliberal restructuring took the form of permanent unemployment and an explosion of precarious low-income jobs. For a while, this development was held in abeyance thanks to the many and various ways of taking on debt, having access to credit. But that grew increasingly difficult after the crisis. The neoliberal crash landing had already long since undermined working class identity. But now the collapse became especially obvious, and suddenly workers in the West found themselves cast out of the economy. And the youth in the South and the North held their stolen futures in common. This was the background to the global wave of protests that rolled across 2010 and 11. But of course, this was also the backdrop to Trump's election victory. Because even though the financial crisis didn't result in a change didn't result in a political change, the political elite seemed unable to look critically at a doctrine which had taken on the status of a self-evident truth. Things actually did shift. Suddenly, the 30-year-long spread of neoliberal accumulation, where savings were made in reproduction and labor power, became visible. Rampant inequality was suddenly not simply an image of the US as the land of opportunity, but a problem. As it became increasingly clear that the main job facing the changing governments in the US and Europe in the wake of the financial crisis was shoring up the economy with complete disregard for the people there, something began to happen. It started in Tunisia and Egypt, and then quickly spread to Southern Europe, where the crisis in Southern Europe was used to press through extensive cuts, which aimed at getting countries like Greece, Spain, and Portugal, and to a lesser degree Italy, to follow the same economic policy as the rest of Europe. The result was obvious. The result was recession and therefore unemployment, falling wages and social unrest. National governments were forced into humiliating deals with the IMF and the European Central Bank without their people having any real say in the matter. Things were especially garish in Greece, where neo-Euro-communist Syriza came to power in the wake of widespread resistance to the loan packages. But Syriza nevertheless had to accept the same kind of deal a short time after their victory, without managing to negotiate as much as a comma. This situation showed that the distance between parliament and street was unbridgeable, and the state in reality functioned as an instrument of domination. There wasn't even much of a political throttle about it. Syriza couldn't change the hand they were dealt, and were engaged in an impossible project from the start. At the turn of the year 2010 and 11, so now I'm moving from the financial crisis to the coming into being of what I consider to be a scattered, heterogeneous global protest movement. At the turn of the year 2010 and 11, people in Athens, Madrid and Lisbon began protesting against the austerity programs. The protest grew rapidly and in no time turned into actual movements which counted participants by the thousands. At the same time, revolution broke out in Tunisia and Egypt, where rising bread prices had caused discontent to boil over. After decades of seeing local potentas or local lumpen dictators supported by the West enrich themselves, something clicked. And in just a few weeks, the Tunisian and Egyptian revolution succeeded in overthrowing Ben Ali and Mubarak. The revolts quickly spread to pretty much all the countries across North Africa and the Middle East. And in no time, there was a civil war in Libya, Syria, and Yemen. Questions were suddenly asked of the post-colonial world order and its neo-colonialism, clientism, and underdevelopment. The Egyptian revolutionaries occupied Tahrir Square in Cairo, and the tactic inspired protest movements in Europe to follow suit, taking over central squares in many European cities, first in Greece, Spain, and Portugal, but not long after in Italy and then most northern European countries. Resistance flared up in the US too. I mean, this was perhaps an even bigger surprise than the election of Trump. I might come down to it actually. Resistance flared up in the United States too, and in September 2011, demonstrators occupied Zuccotti Park in Manhattan to protest against growing inequality and the government bailout of the banks. There had already been a more limited but nevertheless remarkable confrontation in 2009 when students at the University of California protested against a hike in tuition fees. In the summer of 2011, thousands of public sector workers occupied the Wisconsin state capitol in Madison to protest against a ban on collective bargaining. It was, however, first with what came to be known as Occupy Wall Street that something more serious happened in the US. With slogans like "Down with the tyranny of finance capital" and "We are the 99%, the demonstrators in Zuccotti Park pointed to the enormous inequality in the US, where the richest 0.1% owned 35% of value, while the poorest 68% only have 4.2%. Occupy Wall Street spread like wildfire, and there were soon occupations in hundreds of cities across the country, predominantly up and down the coasts. The youth in the big cities took over privatized squares, protested by reclaiming public space, and used it as a stage to experiment with egalitarian politics. As social protest on this scale hadn't been seen in the US since the beginning of the 1970s, Occupy came as a genuine surprise for most people. This is from Occupy Oakland. We had most radical Occupy, most radical part of the Occupy movement in the US. So after more than 30 years of one-sided class struggle in the US, a hole was suddenly cut through what we can, with British cultural theorist Mark Fisher, called capitalist realism. Occupy was a partial rediscovery of earlier types of militancy and anti-capitalist resistance. But the protest fell apart relatively quickly. The period from September to December 2011 was its high point, and the level of activity fell exponentially over the following month. But that's no surprise. Following 30 years of intense neoliberal individualization, it was hard to recreate a language that could articulate a coherent critique of the system beyond moralism and single-issue activism. While, and this is also important, at the same time the FBI and local police did everything they could to keep a lid on the protests. The occupation of Zuccotti Park was, for instance, cleared several times, and many protesters were arrested and given a bruising by the police. But the important thing is that although what came to be known as the Occupy movement fairly quickly fell apart, what actually took place was that the protest movement continued, but continued elsewhere in the US. In March 2012, so only a few months after Occupy Wall Street and all of the other Occupy, local Occupy chapters, in March 2012, in the wake of Occupy's collapse, crackdown on Occupy, a new protest movement arose, Black Lives Matter, what came to be known later as Black Lives Matter, in which African Americans protest against the racist police force that shoots young black men predominantly, but also protested against Africa's white capitalism, which excludes African Americans from the economy. American capitalism produces racial inequality, which means that many black lives are superfluous for capitalism. They don't make up a reserve army. They're just left over. The police have the job of keeping this surplus population at bay. The poor have to be kept down. So the role of the police is to keep a check on those workers who can't sell their labor power. This is a socio-economic context of police violence in the US. Racism and deindustrialization melt together in a brutal cocktail that make African Americans objects for what Afro-pessimist theoretician Frank B. Wilderson calls gratuitous violence. The fact that the police can kill blacks without any kind of consequence. African Americans are simply worth less than others and are therefore far more susceptible to become subjects of police violence. The statistics are disquieting. Every 28 hours the police shoot a black man in the US. This, coupled with the number of black prisoners, African Americans make up 13% of the US population, but 40% of its prison population. This gives an image outline of institutionalized racism. Because of the structural transformations that have taken place in the economy since the 70s, but I talked about this long, slow crash landing of the neoliberal economy. Because of these structural transformations, Many of those who've been classified black haven't been able to find work and therefore have been forced to survive as best they can. In other words, they are excluded from the civil rights movement's American dream and have to survive in poverty or crime. Some have been able to borrow, others have been put in jail. The struggle for rights in the 60s, the I Have a Dream movement, created an image of post-racial America, post-racial US, where African Americans are even able to become president. But the tradition of police violence tells another story, of course, where a disproportionately large number of people who can't get by, who can't access the economy, are designated black, are racialized, and exposed to racism. More than 2 centuries of slavery, this of course has to do with the US as founded on settler colonialism and racism. More than 2 centuries of slavery and nearly 100 years lack of political rights live on in the form of material inequality, which only a lucky few African Americans can overcome. The overwhelming majority are simply left to get by with the little they have. This is, of course, the ordinary function of capitalism, the poor stakeholder. The combination of racist repression and capitalist exclusion is the backdrop to Black Lives Matter. The movement, which first saw the light of day in March 2012, following the killing of the 17-year-old Trayvon Martin. Martin was shot by a white security guard who wasn't even arrested at first, the security guard, and when the public prosecutor was eventually pressed into making a case against him, he was found not guilty. Martin was, of course, just one tragic incident in a long list of killings of young African Americans. In November 2012, Jordan Davis, also aged 17, was shot at a gas station because he couldn't turn the music in his car down. In 2013, Renisha McBride was shot as she asked for help after a traffic accident. Demonstrations were already taking place in 2012 and 2013, but it was first in the aftermath of the killing of Michael Brown in Ferguson in August 2014 that there occurred a mass mobilization against police violence. After things had spilled onto the streets, the situation became a matter of national concern, which politicians and mainstream media were forced to pay attention to. Brown, aged 18, was unarmed, was shot 12 times by a white policeman following a robbery in which Brown had stolen cigarettes from a corner shop. Unrest broke out in Ferguson the following day, with confrontations between the police and outraged African Americans. The protest went on for more than a week. Shops were plundered and cars and petrol stations burned. The police response was heavy-handed. Not seeking to calm the unrest, they drove into the memorial where the Brown family had lain flowers only the day after the killing. The police just ran through the memorial, and thereafter deployed a large part of military hardware which they, like many other police departments, had invested in as part of the war on terror. The police, reinforced by the National Guard, fired tear gas, smoke guns, flash grenades and rubber bullets into the crowd. They were no longer in the usual blue uniforms, but in battle dress, heavily armed with machine guns mounted on armored cars, not unlike those used in Iraq and Afghanistan. A no-fly zone was put out and placed over the city, and the police scrambled helicopters to quell the unrest. In November 2017, a grand jury decided that no charges should be pressed against the officer who shot Brown. The decision led to wide-ranging protests and unrest in the streets, not only in Ferguson, but across more than 100 US cities. The list of murdered young black men is getting longer and longer, and in April 2015, there was more violent unrest when 25-year-old Freddie Gray died from spinal injuries suffered while in police custody. He'd been taken away by the police and bundled into the back of a police van with his hands and feet bound and went into a coma during the journey. The event resulted in demonstrations and rioting in the streets of Baltimore and other American cities. The 6 police officers involved in Gray's death were either acquitted or not brought to trial at all during the summer and fall of 2016. Like Occupy, Black Lives Matter is a large, composite protest movement, a heterogeneous protest movement, which includes many different agendas, from concrete proposals for better training for the police, requiring that officers wear body cams, to revolutionary demands for the abolition of racist capitalism. By drawing on the civil rights movement in the 1960s, Black Lives Matter has formulated demands for institutional reform, but they've also put forward demands for economic compensation for slavery. Others have pointed out, activists in the movement, that only more radical structural transformations will alter the living conditions of those hit hardest by the effects of a crisis-ridden capitalism. So the problem is, of course, not the individual cop's racism, but the social system in which people earmarked black are exposed to structural violence and exclusion. So, in the last instance, of course, the problem is capitalism. A system in which money begets money without respect for people or the planet's biosphere. When speaking about Black Lives Matter, I'm moving into arguing that Trump is a counter-revolution and a protest against these protests, the coming into being of a genuinely revolutionary protest movement in the US. When speaking about Black Lives Matter during the election campaign, Trump didn't beat around the bush. For Trump, it was a question of protecting police officers from black criminals. So instead of Black Lives Matter, Trump suggested talking about Blue Lives Matter. It was the police who were the victims. The police were assaulted by black criminals and were inadequately supported by politicians locally and nationally. According to Trump, this was Trump's reading, Black Lives Matter had declared war against police officers. While the number of cases of violence against the police is the lowest in 25 years in the US, this of course doesn't stop Trump from talking of a dangerous anti-police atmosphere, which his government would fight with all the means at its disposal. There's no doubt about it for Trump. The problem isn't police racism. It isn't actually a problem if the police are racist. The problem is, of course, black criminals, but especially Black Lives Matter, who must therefore be fought off actively. And legislation has already gone through at state level after Trump was sworn in. Laws give police even greater power and further criminalize anti-police violence, including making assault on a police officer a hate crime. The point is, of course, simple enough. As it stood on the White House's homepage the day after Trump became president, I quote, "Our job is not to make life more comfortable for the rioter, the looter, or the violent disruptor." End of quote. So much stronger punitive measures must therefore be put in place. For example, cracking down on resisting arrest. And Trump will allow the police to buy heavy weapons again, which had only been limited after the trouble in Ferguson. There was critique of the way the police was armored after the events in Ferguson. But Trump has again allowed the police to buy all the military equipment that the U.S. Army are willing to sell to the U.S. police, equipment that they bought and employed in Afghanistan and Iraq. So the battle lines are clearly are being drawn very clearly. In combination, I argue, Occupy and Black Lives Matter make up the first serious challenge to American capitalism in 40 years. And Trump is a violent answer to this challenge. The fear of radical change brings late fascist solutions into play. American capitalism's problems run deep, and it's time for another kettle of fish. We're dealing with a process of discontinuous dissolution, in which one conflict replaces another in a run of events, riddled with contradictions, in which revolutionary tendencies are constantly derailed or repressed. This is the context of Trump's election victory. This is the context of Trump's presidency. Was Trump a mobilization of the forgotten and overlooked, arrived in the small towns of middle America? If Occupy was the youth in New York and California, and Black Lives Matter was the black population, then Trump's supporters are the white and blue-collar workers outside of the metropolis. The ones who reject the last 30 years of economic restructuring and demand the restitution of the previous white welfare of a previous era. In other words, after Occupy, Trump. So Trump as a counter-revolution. There's a clear counter-revolutionary element to the election of Trump. Taken together, Occupy and Black Lives Matter are the sign of the coming into being of a new protest movement, of a nascent reckoning with that racist capitalist system in the US. Trump is a markedly national capitalist answer, which the white and middle classes respond to as they resolutely reject any fundamental break with their privileged access to wage labor. The logic seems to be that jobs that are still in the US are the prerogative of white people. Thus, 45% of white women voted Trump in an attempt to guarantee themselves and their offspring a first pick on jobs and consumer goods. Understood this way, Trump is anything but a break, but of course rather a desperate continuation of previous policies. It's rather a desperate extension of white American democracy under pressure. We've now reached a stage at which the world market has reached the limits of possible expansion and is replaced by national conservative protection of the internal market. The counter-revolution is being organized. So what I'm trying to argue is, of course, that when analyzing Trump, we should both stress the continuity and the discontinuity of Trump. That, of course, Trump is in many ways a continuity of a settler colonial racist American capitalist system, but he's not only that. He's also, in a certain sense, a change, a political change. Trump is there's a kind of truth in Trump, insofar as he's somehow a symptom of an underlying, longer, 40-year-long crisis in the U.S. economy. That's the contradictory nature of Trump. And of course, he's not in any way able to deliver on his promises. He would probably just accelerate the ongoing chaos and dissolution. But there is a significant shift from a kind of neoliberal hegemonic stance, the first Clinton, Obama, the second Clinton, and then to Trump. And this turn to Trump is necessary because of the possibility of the coming into being of a revolutionary perspective. Trump is a protest against the protest, a highly violent swatting away of demands for another world. Instead, the US will return to the good old days when the white man was the unchallenged master. Things have been brought into disorder, and Trump will restore the natural order of things. Women, blacks, and all other subalterns will be put in their place. This is what Make America Great Again really means. It means the national community organized like a family, with Herr Trump, with Dad Trump at the head the table. President Trump is a domestic tyrant who chalks all the recalcitrant blacks in jail, grabs hysterical white women by the crotch, and bombs Muslims. The crisis forces capital to disregard the cosmopolitan rhetoric, freedom of movement, and democracy prevalent in the 1990s. Things now need tightening up, and a revival of fascism appears as a solution.